There is a family whose name you almost certainly do not know. They do not appear in the standard histories of the British Empire in the way that the Rothschilds appear, or the East India Company directors, or the great Victorian industrialists whose portraits hang in the National Portrait Gallery in London. They do not have a museum named after them, or a foundation that issues press releases about their philanthropic activities, or a Wikipedia entry that most people would think to search for. And yet at the height of their power in the mid-19th century, the Sassoon family controlled one of the largest commercial empires in Asia, sat at the center of the most profitable and most destructive trade in the history of the British Empire, and accumulated a fortune whose scale can only be understood when you understand what it was built on. It was built on opium. Not metaphorically. Not as a sideline or an incidental element of a broader commercial operation. Opium was the foundation, the primary product, the commodity around which the entire Sassoon commercial empire was organized, from the poppy fields of British India where the drug was grown under colonial administration, to the warehouses of Bombay where it was processed and packaged, to the ships that carried it across the Indian Ocean, to the network of trading houses in Canton and Shanghai and Hong Kong through which it was distributed into the Chinese market, to the banks that held the profits, to the insurance companies that underwrote the risk, to the political connections in London and Calcutta and Delhi that protected the whole operation from the interference of anyone who might have the power and the inclination to stop it. The story of the Sassoon family is not a simple story of villainy. Nothing in the history of empire ever is. It is a story of a family that was itself, in certain respects, a product of persecution and displacement, that built its commercial power in the spaces that empire created, that operated entirely within the legal and political frameworks of the British imperial system, and that did what successful commercial dynasties have always done, which is to identify the most profitable trade available and organize their operations around it with maximum efficiency. The fact that the most profitable trade available happened to be the systematic addiction of tens of millions of people to a narcotic substance whose consequences for Chinese society were catastrophic is not incidental to the story. It is the story, but it needs to be understood in its full context rather than extracted from that context and condemned in isolation, because the Sassoon family did not create the opium trade. They inherited it, expanded it, and became its most efficient practitioners. The trade itself was a product of British imperial policy that served British imperial interests long before the Sassoons arrived on the scene. To understand the Sassoons, you have to begin not in China or India but in Baghdad. In the early 18th century, the Sassoon family were among the most prominent members of the Jewish community of Baghdad, a community with deep roots in Mesopotamia stretching back to the Babylonian exile and a long tradition of involvement in commerce and finance. The Jewish communities of the Ottoman Middle East occupied a specific and in some ways privileged economic niche. They were, as non-Muslim minorities, excluded from certain aspects of political and social life in Ottoman society. But they were permitted, and in many cases actively encouraged, to engage in commerce and finance, activities that Muslim religious law made complicated for Muslim merchants, and that the Ottoman state found it convenient to outsource to minority communities whose commercial networks crossed the boundaries of empires and religions. The Sassoons were wealthy and well-connected within this world. The patriarch of the family's commercial dynasty, Sheikh Sassoon ben Saleh, served as the chief treasurer to the Ottoman governors of Baghdad for decades, a position of considerable financial power and considerable political exposure. When a new governor arrived in Baghdad in the 1820s with a reputation for extorting the city's Jewish community and a specific grievance against the Sassoon family, Sheikh Sassoon made the decision that wealthy families in politically exposed positions throughout history have always made when the political environment turns against them. He left. Taking his family and as much of his fortune as could be moved, he relocated to Bushehr on the Persian Gulf and then to Bombay, the great commercial city of British India, where a large and established Jewish merchant community had already created a network of commercial relationships that spanned the Indian Ocean world. His son David Sassoon arrived in Bombay in 1832 and immediately understood what he was looking at. Bombay was not just a city. It was the commercial gateway to the most profitable trading system in the world. The British East India Company, which had been the dominant commercial and political power in India for over a century, had built an imperial trading infrastructure of extraordinary sophistication. Raw materials flowed from the interior of India to Bombay and out to the markets of Europe and Asia. Manufactured goods flowed back in. And at the center of this system, generating profits that dwarfed everything else in the imperial commercial landscape, was opium. The mechanics of the opium trade that David Sassoon encountered in Bombay in 1832 had been refined over decades of British colonial administration into one of the most efficient systems of organized drug trafficking in human history. The British East India Company held a monopoly on opium production in the Bengal region of India. Farmers were required to grow poppy under contracts that gave them little choice and less profit. The harvested opium was processed into standardized chests at company facilities and auctioned to private merchants in Calcutta. Those merchants, operating under licenses that the company controlled, then shipped the opium to the China coast, where it was sold to Chinese distributors who moved it into the interior of the country through networks that extended into every province of the empire. The Chinese government had banned opium importation. The ban was openly violated by British merchants operating from ships anchored in international waters off the Chinese coast and from warehouses in the Portuguese territory of Macau, in arrangements that the British colonial authorities in India facilitated, protected, and profited from. The trade was illegal under Chinese law and entirely legal under British imperial law. The profits flowed to British merchants, to the East India Company's revenues, and ultimately to the British government through the taxes and duties that the trade generated. The opium trade was not a criminal enterprise operating in the shadows of the British Empire. It was one of the central pillars of British imperial finance in Asia, operated in broad daylight, defended by the British government when China tried to stop it, and worth approximately 1/7 of the entire revenue of British India at its peak. David Sassoon looked at this system and saw an opportunity that his commercial instincts, his capital, his family network, and his position as a connected outsider in the Bombay merchant community had uniquely prepared him to exploit. He entered the opium trade, built his operation around it with the methodical efficiency of a man who had grown up in a family that had been managing complex commercial and financial relationships across the Ottoman world for generations, and within 2 decades had made the Sassoon family the dominant private player in the most profitable trade in Asia. The scale of what he built is difficult to convey without the numbers. By the 1860s, the Sassoon family was handling somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of all opium exported from India to China. They had offices in Bombay, Calcutta, Canton, Shanghai, Hong Kong, Singapore, and London. They had their own fleet of ships. They had their own warehousing operations at every major point in the supply chain. They had their own banking operation to handle the financial flows that the trade generated. And they had something that no balance sheet could capture, but that was perhaps their most valuable asset of all. They had relationships with the British colonial administration in India, with the merchant communities of China and Southeast Asia, with the financial houses of London, with the political establishment that set the policies that made the whole operation possible and profitable. David Sassoon did not achieve all of this by accident. He achieved it through a combination of commercial genius, family discipline, and a specific organizational innovation that set the Sassoon operation apart from every other merchant house in the Asian trade. He staffed his offices exclusively with members of the Baghdadi Jewish community, importing young men from Baghdad and Bombay, training them in the Sassoon commercial methods, binding them to the family enterprise through a combination of employment, community obligation, and the shared identity of a minority diaspora in a foreign commercial environment. In an era before telegraphs and international telephone calls, when the management of a commercial empire spread across thousands of miles of ocean depended entirely on the trustworthiness and competence of the people running the distant offices, this organizational model gave the Sassoon operation an advantage that their competitors could not replicate. They were not just a company. They were a community. And the loyalty and discipline that community identity provided was worth more than any formal management structure that money alone could buy. The opium moved. The money came back. And the Sassoons grew richer with every chest that crossed the Indian Ocean and found its way into the lungs and the lives of the people who would eventually be described, in the clinical language of colonial administration, as the opium problem of China. The human cost of what the Sassoons were building their fortune on was not invisible. It was not hidden behind statistics or obscured by the distance between the producing end and the consuming end of the supply chain in the way that the costs of other colonial commodities were sometimes rendered invisible by geography and ignorance. The devastation that opium was causing in China was documented, described, and publicly known throughout the period of the Sassoon family's greatest commercial expansion. It was known in London. It was known in Calcutta. It was known in Bombay. And it was known, in the most intimate and immediate sense, in the streets and villages and family homes of China where the drug was consuming lives with a thoroughness that contemporary observers compared, with no exaggeration, to a civilizational catastrophe. The numbers, even the conservative estimates from the period, are staggering. By the middle of the 19th century, somewhere between 10 and 15% of the entire Chinese population was addicted to opium. In some coastal provinces where the drug had been available longest and had penetrated deepest into the social fabric, the addiction rates were considerably higher. Government officials were addicted. Soldiers were addicted. Merchants, farmers, scholars, women, children. The drug moved through Chinese society with the indiscriminate appetite of a plague, and like a plague it destroyed the productive capacity of the people it consumed. Addicted workers could not work reliably. Addicted soldiers could not fight effectively. Addicted officials could not govern honestly. The social and economic fabric of one of the oldest and most sophisticated civilizations on Earth was being systematically degraded by a substance that the British Empire was importing at scale and defending at gunpoint. The Chinese government understood exactly what was happening. The Emperor Daoguang, whose reign covered the period of the trade's most explosive growth, received memorial after memorial from provincial governors and court officials documenting the devastation and demanding action. The action taken was the appointment of a scholar official named Lin Zexu as imperial commissioner with a specific mandate to end the opium trade by whatever means necessary. Lin Zexu was not a man who did things by halves. He arrived in Canton in 1839, gave the foreign merchants trading in opium a deadline to surrender their stocks, and when the British Superintendent of Trade Charles Elliot negotiated a surrender of approximately 20,000 chests of opium on behalf of the merchants, Lin Zexu had every chest destroyed. He mixed the opium with salt and lime in large trenches dug on the beach and flushed it into the sea. Over 1,000 tons of opium, worth millions of pounds, dissolved into the ocean while Lin Zexu wrote a letter to Queen Victoria asking her, in the name of basic human decency, to stop. The letter never received a reply. What it received, instead, was the First Opium War. The British government's decision to go to war with China to force the resumption of the opium trade is one of the most nakedly cynical acts of imperial aggression in the entire history of British foreign policy, and the competition for that distinction is extremely fierce. The war was debated in Parliament. William Gladstone, then a young opposition MP who would go on to be Prime Minister 4 times, stood up in the House of Commons and delivered a speech that named what was happening with a moral clarity that the government benches found deeply inconvenient. He asked whether a war more unjust in its origins, or more calculated to cover Britain with permanent disgrace, had ever been waged. He was right. The war was waged anyway. The British Navy and Army, equipped with the technological superiority that the Industrial Revolution had provided, defeated the Chinese forces with a completeness that shocked even those who had anticipated a British military advantage. The Treaty of Nanjing, signed in 1842, did not explicitly legalize opium. The legal fiction that the trade remained technically prohibited under Chinese law was maintained, because making the war's purpose explicit in a formal treaty would have been too embarrassing even for the Victorian political establishment. What the treaty did was open 5 Chinese ports to British trade, cede Hong Kong to Britain in perpetuity, and impose an indemnity on China of 21 million silver dollars, a significant portion of which was explicitly designated as compensation to the British merchants for the opium that Lin Zexu had destroyed. China was required to pay for the drugs that had been confiscated while being illegally imported into its territory in violation of its own laws. The moral inversion was complete. For the Sassoon family, the Treaty of Nanjing was a commercial watershed. The opening of the 5 treaty ports, Shanghai most importantly among them, transformed the geography of the China trade and created new opportunities for expansion that the Sassoons moved to exploit with their characteristic speed and organizational discipline. Shanghai, a relatively minor city before the treaty ports were established, grew with extraordinary speed into the commercial capital of the China coast, a city unlike any other in Asia, a place where the legal jurisdictions of half a dozen foreign powers overlapped in a complex architecture of concessions and settlements that created a zone of commercial activity largely outside the reach of Chinese law and Chinese authority. The Sassoon operation in Shanghai became one of the anchors of the city's commercial life. They built warehouses along the Bund, the famous waterfront strip that became the visual symbol of foreign commercial power in China. They established banking operations. They financed not just the opium trade but the broader commercial infrastructure of the treaty port system, the cotton trade, the silk trade, the real estate market of the settlements, the financial instruments that allowed merchants to move money across the thousands of miles between Shanghai and Bombay and London with a speed and reliability that the commercial system demanded. The opium was the foundation, but Shanghai was becoming something larger, a commercial ecosystem in which the Sassoon family occupied a central and in some respects irreplaceable position. David Sassoon died in 1864, wealthy beyond the imagination of the Baghdad merchant community from which he had come, and left his commercial empire to his sons. The eldest son Abdullah, who had anglicized his name to Albert, took over the primary business. But it was the second son Elias who proved to be the most consequential figure of the second generation, and whose decisions created a rupture within the family that transformed its commercial structure in ways that would determine the Sassoon story for the rest of the century. Elias Sassoon disagreed with his brother Albert about the direction of the family business. The specific nature of their disagreement has been somewhat obscured by the discretion with which both branches of the family subsequently managed their public image, but the commercial consequences were clear. In 1867, Elias broke away from the main Sassoon operation and established his own firm, E.D. Sassoon and Company, in direct competition with his brothers David Sassoon and Sons. The family that had built its commercial empire on the organizational discipline of unified family loyalty had split. And the split, paradoxically, made both branches more powerful by creating competition between two well-capitalized, well-connected operations that drove each to expand and innovate in ways that a single unified enterprise might not have done. The timing of the split coincided with a broader shift in the structure of the China trade that would have profound consequences for the Sassoon commercial model. The opium trade was changing. The Second Opium War, fought between 1856 and 1860 when Britain and France combined to force further commercial concessions from China, had resulted in the formal legalization of opium importation in the Treaty of Tientsin. The legal fiction that had maintained the trade in a gray zone between Chinese prohibition and British imperial protection was dissolved. Opium was now openly legal. And legalization, combined with the expansion of domestic Chinese opium cultivation that had been developing for decades, was beginning to change the economics of the trade in ways that would gradually erode the extraordinary profit margins that had built the Sassoon fortune. Indian opium faced increasing competition from Chinese-grown opium, which had the structural advantage of not requiring an ocean crossing. The Sassoon operation, built around the specific commercial geography of the Bombay to Shanghai supply chain, was going to need to adapt. An adaptation, for a commercial dynasty that had organized itself entirely around a single commodity trade, was a more complicated challenge than it might appear from the outside. The Sassoons adapted. They had no choice. But the manner of their adaptation, the way they used the fortune that opium had generated to build new commercial structures that would outlast the trade that created them, is the part of the story that reveals most clearly how the wealth of the drug trade became embedded in the legitimate commercial and financial infrastructure of the modern world so thoroughly that the connection became invisible. The money needed somewhere to go, and the Sassoons had very clear ideas about where to send it. The story of the Sassoon family does not end with the opium trade. It transforms. And the transformation is in some ways more interesting than the original accumulation, because it reveals something about the nature of dynastic wealth that the accumulation phase, for all its drama, cannot fully show. The Sassoons did not simply make their money and keep it. They converted it. They took the capital generated by the systematic addiction of tens of millions of people and they moved it, deliberately and skillfully, into forms that were not just more respectable but more durable. Into real estate. Into banking. Into the social and cultural infrastructure of the British establishment. Into the kind of institutional presence that outlasts the specific commercial activity that created it and takes on a life of its own, disconnected from its origins, legitimate on its own terms, permanent in a way that the opium trade itself could never be. The opium trade was always going to end. Not because the British government developed a conscience about it, though individual British politicians and reformers argued against it with moral clarity for decades. It ended because it became commercially obsolete. Indian opium's dominance of the Chinese market was gradually undermined in the late 19th and early 20th centuries by the expansion of domestic Chinese opium production. Chinese farmers, observing the extraordinary profits that the trade generated, began growing their own poppies in provinces that the imperial government had previously suppressed but could no longer effectively police after the humiliations of the unequal treaties had weakened the authority of the Qing dynasty. Domestic Chinese opium was cheaper than imported Indian opium. It did not need to be shipped across the Indian Ocean. It did not generate the same profits for the merchant houses that had built their operations around the import trade. The market that the Sassoons had dominated was being displaced not by moral reform but by competition. The Sassoon family's response to this competitive pressure was to diversify. The commercial infrastructure they had built across Asia, the offices, the ships, the banking relationships, the connections to colonial administration, was capable of handling commodities other than opium. Cotton textiles, real estate development in Shanghai, banking and financial services for the expanding commercial communities of the treaty ports. The Sassoon operation pivoted, not all at once and not without difficulty, but with the commercial flexibility that a family accustomed to operating across multiple markets and multiple legal jurisdictions had developed over generations. By the time the opium trade had declined sufficiently to no longer be the primary driver of Sassoon revenues, the family had already established itself in enough alternative commercial activities to sustain its wealth and its position without it. The most significant of these alternative activities was real estate, particularly in Shanghai. The Sassoon family's investment in Shanghai property, begun in the mid-19th century when the treaty ports were first opening and land values were still modest, produced returns over the following decades that rivaled the opium trade itself in their scale. Shanghai grew from a minor Chinese city to one of the most important commercial centers in the world in the space of half a century, and the Sassoon family owned significant portions of the physical infrastructure through which that growth expressed itself. The buildings on the Bund, the hotels, the commercial properties in the international settlement where the family's trading operations had their base. The value of these assets compounded with the growth of the city itself, turning the initial investment of opium profits into a real estate empire whose legitimacy could not be questioned and whose returns required no further engagement with the drug trade that had made them possible. Victor Sassoon, the most colorful and in many ways the most significant member of the family's later generations, embodied this transformation more completely than any other individual. Born in 1881, the great-grandson of David Sassoon, Victor inherited the family's commercial empire at a point when the opium trade was a fading memory and the Shanghai real estate business was at the height of its prosperity. He was educated at Eton and Cambridge. He served as a pilot in the First World War and was injured in a crash that left him with a permanent limp he carried with studied elegance for the rest of his life. He moved to Shanghai in the 1920s and threw himself into the life of the city with an energy and a flamboyance that made him one of its most visible and most talked-about figures. Victor Sassoon's Shanghai was the Shanghai of the 1920s and 1930s, the city that its admirers called the Paris of the East and that its critics described with equal accuracy as a monument to colonial exploitation dressed in the clothes of cosmopolitan sophistication. It was a city of extraordinary wealth and extraordinary poverty existing in such close proximity that the contrast was impossible to ignore, though many of its most prominent residents managed to ignore it with remarkable consistency. Victor Sassoon was not among those who ignored it, exactly, but his engagement with the city's contradictions was more aesthetic than political. He was a collector of art, of racehorses, of beautiful women, of remarkable people. He hosted parties at his Cathay Hotel, the most glamorous building on the Bund, that brought together the international community of Shanghai in a setting of such deliberate luxury that the distance between the hotel ballroom and the poverty of the Chinese city outside its walls felt, for the duration of the party, absolute. The Cathay Hotel, which Victor Sassoon built in 1929, is perhaps the most perfect symbol of what the Sassoon fortune had become by the 20th century. It was built on land whose value derived from the treaty system that the Opium Wars had imposed on China. It was financed by capital accumulated through the opium trade. It was staffed by Chinese workers whose country had been opened to foreign commercial exploitation by the military force that the opium trade had generated the political will to deploy. And it was one of the most beautiful and celebrated buildings in Asia, a monument to architectural ambition and commercial sophistication that attracted guests from around the world and that Shanghai residents of every nationality regarded with genuine pride. The building was completely disconnected, in the experience of everyone who entered it, from the history that had made it possible. That disconnection was the Sassoon fortune's greatest achievement. Not the accumulation of wealth, which was remarkable but not unique. The conversion of that wealth into something that could be admired without reference to its origins. Victor Sassoon's Shanghai life ended in 1941 when the Japanese occupation of the international settlement made his position untenable. He left for India and eventually settled in Nassau in the Bahamas, where he spent the post-war decades breeding racehorses with considerable success and maintaining the lifestyle of a wealthy cosmopolitan gentleman of the old school. He died in 1961, leaving the bulk of his fortune to a charitable foundation. The Sassoon commercial empire in Shanghai had been lost to the Communist Revolution of 1949, which nationalized the family's Chinese properties along with every other foreign commercial holding in the country. The empire that David Sassoon had built from Bombay in the 1830s on the back of the opium trade, that had expanded through the treaty ports and the Opium Wars and the development of Shanghai into one of the great commercial fortunes of the 19th century, ended not with a moral reckoning but with a political one. The Chinese Communist Party did not expropriate the Sassoon properties because of the opium. It expropriated them because they were foreign. The moral history of how they had been acquired was irrelevant to the political logic of 1949. The property was gone regardless. What remained was the English branch of the family and its accumulated social capital. And here the story takes one of its most unexpected turns. Because the most famous Sassoon of the 20th century was not Victor, with his hotels and his racehorses and his Shanghai parties. It was Siegfried. Siegfried Sassoon, the poet. The man who threw his military cross into the Mersey River in 1917 as an act of protest against the continuation of the First World War. The man who wrote poetry about the trenches that remains among the most devastating anti-war literature in the English language. The man whose moral courage in publicly refusing to return to the front, at a time when such refusal could have resulted in court-martial and imprisonment, stands as one of the most remarkable acts of individual conscience in the history of British public life. Siegfried Sassoon was the great-grandson of Sheikh Sassoon ben Saleh, the Baghdad patriarch who had fled to Bombay and whose son David had built the Opium Empire. The fortune that had educated Siegfried, that had given him the leisure to write poetry and the social position to make his protest heard rather than simply dismissed, was the fortune of the opium trade. The moral clarity with which he condemned the senseless slaughter of the First World War was financed, at several generations' remove, by the systematic addiction of tens of millions of Chinese people to a substance that had destroyed their lives with a thoroughness that made the trenches look almost merciful by comparison. This is not a simple irony. It is the kind of historical complexity that resists the clean moral narratives that we prefer to impose on the past. Siegfried Sassoon was genuinely courageous. His poetry is genuinely important. His protest against the war was a real act of conscience that cost him real social and professional consequences. None of that is diminished by the origin of the fortune that made his life possible. But none of it erases that origin either. The two things exist simultaneously, the courage and the complicity, the moral clarity and the moral debt, in a relationship that cannot be resolved by choosing one side of it to emphasize and the other to ignore. That unresolvable complexity is, in the end, what the Sassoon story is really about. Not the opium, though the opium is central. Not the wealth, though the wealth is staggering. Not the social ascent, though the social ascent is remarkable. It is about the specific way in which imperial commercial wealth moves through time. How it accumulates in one generation through activities that could not survive direct moral scrutiny. How it is converted in the next generation into assets and institutions and social positions that carry no visible trace of their origins. How it produces, in subsequent generations, individuals whose lives and achievements are entirely real and entirely dependent on a foundation that the family has learned, very skillfully, not to examine too closely. The opium that David Sassoon shipped from Bombay to Canton in the 1830s and 1840s destroyed millions of lives. The money it generated built hotels and funded poets and endowed charities and bought knighthoods and entertained princes and constructed buildings that people still photograph today. The connection between those two facts is real, documented, and almost entirely absent from the way the Sassoon family is remembered, in the limited contexts where it is remembered at all. That absence is not accidental. It is the last and most durable product of the Sassoon commercial genius. The ability to make money in a way that history would find it convenient to forget. They were very good at making money. They were even better at making the memory of how they made it disappear.